Good afternoon, I'm Seb Thorpe and I'll be your host for today's event. Thank you all very much for taking the time to join us. We understand that this may have been a challenge for various reasons and for many after a long working day, so your attendance is very much appreciated. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session, Nurturing Nutrition, Building Healthy Foundations in the Early Years. Nutrition, as we know, is so important to the work that we do, and today we're going to explore it from multiple perspectives, ensuring that we go away with new ideas and practical strategies to take back into our settings. Before we hear from our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to introduce or reintroduce Begin Bright, who may still be a new name for some. Begin Bright are part of Cognition Learning Group, a global group who've been operating through its brands here in the UK for 15 years and is a key provider to government. Since 2024, Begin Bright have been delivering the Department for Education funded Foundation Years programme to provide a range of services that support early years educators from all specialisms by promoting sector updates, policy and guidance information, resources and further support. We've been busy managing the Foundation Year's social media channels, publishing monthly newsletters and creating and publishing support resources to the Foundation Year's website. This is the third event that we've now hosted, so thank you for joining, whether this is your first, second or third time. Please do continue to engage with us as this is vital to delivering a high quality service. Moving on to this afternoon's event, we have a selection of fantastic speakers lined up. Firstly, Wendy Radcliffe and Caroline Hearn from Ofsted and Laura Linden and Alex Robinson from the Department for Education will walk us through the nutrition guidance updates to the EYFS to be implemented from September of this year. Following that, Claire Theobald from the British Nutrition Foundation will talk about the free resources available on the Foundation's website that can be used by all early years settings. And finally, Catherine Lipp, registered nutritionist, will discuss the important role an early years educator plays during mealtimes. A question and answer session will be conducted directly after the Ofsted and DfE section, allowing you to ask them your questions before we move on to our other speakers. And questions can be left in the Q&A box that you can access at the top of your screens. Quickly before we begin, just a few housekeeping points to be mindful of. The session will be recorded and shared online along with the presentation slides after the event. The Q&A function, as I've said, will be open throughout the presentations, so please do leave questions that can be picked up at the end of each of the presentations. The chat function is disabled, but we will be using the interactive features such as thumbs up to keep things engaging, so please, I do encourage you to take part in that. And now we can move on to our first presentation to be delivered by the Department for Education and Ofsted.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura Linden and I'm the team leader for Early Years Safeguarding Health and Wellbeing at the Department for Education. I'm here to talk to you today about the new nutrition guidance that will come into force as part of the EYFS changes in September 2025. As you'll all already know, within the EYFS there's an existing requirement that states where children are provided with meals, snacks and drinks, these must be healthy, balanced and nutritious. However, despite this being a mandatory requirement, research suggests that the nutritional quality of the food being served by some providers is low, with anecdotal evidence indicating that some educators do not fully understand what constitutes as healthy and nutritious food for young children. The EYFS currently signposts to the example menus for early years settings in England guidance, which was developed to help meet the EYFS requirement for food and drink. This guidance was last updated in 2017, and some aspects no longer align with latest government guidance on nutrition. In addition, research indicates that the use of the guidance is low, and we have heard from stakeholders that the guidance is not well liked because it is too long and not accessible or engaging. We've also heard calls from the sector and wider for clearer mandatory food standards in early years settings. To address these concerns, the department launched a non-public targeted consultation with early years and nutrition experts to seek views on replacing the example menus with this guidance. We also sought views on adding a new requirement into the EYFS for providers to have regard to the new nutrition guidance to help them fulfil the existing food and drink requirement. The responses were overwhelmingly in favour of making this change, indicating that it will be helpful and important for the sector to improve the quality of food served in early years settings. To clarify, it will not be a mandatory requirement to follow the guidance, but providers must have regard to the guidance and only depart from it where they have good reason to do so. Therefore, this change will go some of the way to answer calls for stricter, clearer food standards, while still allowing flexibility in instances where implementing these standards may be more difficult. For example, when providing food for a child with specific dietary or sensory needs. A link to the guidance will be circulated alongside this presentation, and I would encourage everyone to familiarise themselves with it in plenty of time before September. However, I'm sure that many settings will already be serving food that is healthy, balanced and nutritious given the existing requirement. What we hope is that this guidance will help reinforce good practice and maybe also provide some new meals and snack ideas. I won't read an exhaustive list of everything the guidance covers, but key points are covered, such as feeding babies. This includes guidance around supporting breastfeeding and infant formula, introducing solid foods and foods to avoid, food and drink guidelines for children aged 1 to 5 years. We've tried to make this guidance concise in the form of a table listing foods that should be provided, limited or avoided. Portion sizes, menu planning, recipes. The recipe section has links to recipes on the Start for Life website and the Help for Early Years Providers platform, so providers can easily click through to instantly access these. Communicating with parents and carers, and this includes developing a food and nutrition policy, cost-effective healthy food, and we also cover specific dietary requirements, and this includes allergies and food for religious faiths and beliefs. I think it's also important to say that we don't just link out to recipes, but also to other useful government documents and websites. For example, the NHS website in regard to infant formula and weaning, and the Help for Early Years Providers website in regard to food safety, including choking prevention. We've tried to make the advice as comprehensive as possible, and as I mentioned before, the food and drink guidelines for children aged 1 to 5 years have been redeveloped in the form of a table stating foods to provide, limit and avoid. I've taken a snapshot for this slide to demonstrate what I'm talking about. We have the type of food listed on the left and then the guidelines relating to particular foods on the right. We're hoping that this makes the expectations really clear. One of the big differences between this new guidance and the example menus for early years settings in England is that there is not a strict set menu. The example menus were devised by DHSC considering strict energy requirements and dietary reference values for children. We are aware that children's attendance in early years settings varies greatly from child to child. A few children may eat almost all their meals during a week in the setting, whereas some children may only attend for 1 or 2 half days a week. Because of this, the new guidance has overarching principles for healthy eating. On the slide, I have a screenshot of the example menus for children aged 7 to 12 months. It has a few ideas for breakfast, lunch or tea, and for the starter, side or second course. The text that is highlighted blue actually links out to the relevant website, which has the recipe. Another difference you might notice is that a dessert is not suggested after every meal. Instead, to ensure children get enough energy and a wide variety of nutrients, for children aged 10 months and above, a starter, side dish or second dish is suggested. Providing a dessert after every meal encourages children to have a sweet tooth, and we all know that too much sugar has detrimental health impacts. However, we are of course not saying that desserts cannot be offered. Desserts can be the second dish, but of course must still follow the guidance. We are aware that some providers have concerns around food brought in from home. This may be due to fears around allergies and choking. As I hope you're all aware, this nutrition guidance is going to be brought in along with the safeguarding changes to the EYFS. Within that is a section on safer eating, which if followed will help keep children safe regardless of whether they are eating food prepared at home or in the setting. We have a section in this guidance to help providers with managing food brought in from home. We know that many settings already have children who bring in their own food and manage this successfully. This section was devised with advice from the Food Standard Agency and sector experts. Throughout this new guidance, we've tried to ensure we have been as inclusive as possible and to highlight the importance of relationships and information sharing with parents and carers. You'll see we recommend introducing a food and nutrition policy to your setting, regardless of whether or not children bring in their own food. Setting a food and nutrition policy is not a mandatory requirement, and I won't read each of the points we recommend including in your policy. However, having a food and nutrition policy will help you share your approach to food provision with parents and your expectations if they do choose to send in their own food. We're really lucky, as Seb outlined, to be joined by some Ofsted colleagues today. So we've got Caroline and Wendy here, and they will be answering some questions related to this new guidance that we've heard that have come in from some providers.
Hi, Laura. So I'm Caroline Hearn. I'm the Specialist Advisor for Early Years Regulatory Policy at Ofsted, and I'm joined by my colleague Wendy today.
Hi everybody, Wendy Ratcliffe here. I'm one of His Majesty's Inspectors and also Ofsted's Principal Officer for our Early Education Policy. So we've got some questions, haven't we? I think what might be useful just before we start might be just to kind of like set the scene about inspection, so it's clear. Is that okay, Laura?
Yes, please. That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so let's just remind ourselves that our inspectors are charged with finding out what it's like to be a child in your setting with you, and we are required to inspect in line with the principles and requirements of the EYFS, so the DfE's EYFS. But inspection ultimately isn't a compliance checklist, but it is about finding out what it's like to be a child here. And therefore, because each setting is unique, then every inspection will be unique. And I think a key message from us today is if you're doing what's right for your children, then you are doing what is right for Ofsted. But I know we've got some specific questions that have come in, haven't we?
We have, yeah. Okay, so I'll start with the first one. So the nutrition guidance outlines that settings can establish their own food and nutrition policy on food brought in from home so that it aligns with the healthy options provided by the setting. If when an Ofsted inspection takes place, there are children with packed lunches that contain food that does not align with the new nutrition guidance, would the setting be considered to not be fulfilling their requirement to have regard to the guidance?
Okay. Do you want to start with that one, Caroline?
I certainly can. It's a good question, isn't it? 'Cause that kind of, how do you manage what comes in that's sort of out of your control? So we'll consider the effort the setting is making regarding the food and nutrition policy rather than looking at what specific food parents are providing. So if the provider's making that effort to educate parents in respect of healthy choices, that would what would be discussed. And this would only be discussed if it was a particular area of focus during the inspection. As Wendy has said, we don't look at everything all the time, so don't think we're going to suddenly come in and want to be looking at food and food choices at every inspection or regulatory visit. That won't be happening. But it'd be part of that general discussion as we unpack what you do and how you deliver what you deliver. If we thought that a setting were taking insufficient action to support children's well-being, we would then look at that and we may set actions in that respect. But we understand that despite efforts settings put into supporting families to make healthy choices, some families may be harder to bring on board and to support, and this could be a longer term journey for that setting. And the leaders will look at the journey that the leaders and the practitioners are on to get that family on board and help them understand what's best for children. So providers, you must have regard to the nutrition guidance, and this will mean that the guidance should be taken into account and only departed from when there's really good reason, and as providers provide a healthy balanced as providers must provide a healthy, balanced and nutritious food. The department believes it should be a relatively minor change, and I think it is, because I think what we see already is good education. In the past, the dental changes have come in. There's already a good understanding of healthy, balanced diets, and we're seeing that when we go out and inspect. So it doesn't seem that big a leap to what's already happening out there.
And I think it's important, Caroline, isn't it? Our inspectors do need to take into account that context in which a provider is working and consider the impact on children where things aren't quite working as well as they should. So I think that's an important thing to remember.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So if it's clear that they've made every effort, you know, to do that, then, you know, they're not going to be held to account for families continually sending in food like
Some
that.
will, and it's a journey.
Yeah.
Are they helping that parent understand where that's leading? Yeah, sorry, Wendy, you go.
I was just going to say, depends on what the impact it's having on children, ultimately. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so another question we've had is, some providers have voiced concerns around packed lunches in regard to food safety, specifically in regard to allergies and choking risks. Will providers be expected to check packed lunches in relation to these risks?
So I think, Laura, you've already kind of covered some of this off, haven't you, in terms of that from the updates that will happen in September. There will be some updates around safer eating. They're going to be strengthened, and we all know and understand the rationale for that. So in addition to the existing requirement of providers obtaining that information about special dietary requirement a child has, at each mealtime and snack time, providers must be clear about who's responsible for checking the food that's being provided and that it meets the requirements of each child, as well as checking the food in relation to dietary requirements. And that also extends to ensuring that food is prepared in a way to prevent choking based on each child's individual stage of development. And also that will include what's provided from home to setting, and also thinking about that the requirement for children always must be in sight and hearing of a member of staff while eating. Again, that's going to be strengthened so that where possible, a member of staff should be sitting facing children when they're eating. We know the importance of that when it comes to choking. So I think ultimately it is for settings and providers to think about how they're going to be meeting those requirements. And I would imagine providers are already thinking about how they manage their meal times and how they're managing what is being brought in through packed lunches from home.
Yes, we do know that some settings do already have children that bring in their own food, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, absolutely. And it may on an inspection, it may prompt a conversation around, how children are being helped to stay healthy and those nutritious meals that they need and all of those things. But yeah, it will depend on what's happening in that particular setting, in that particular context, and what the impact on children is.
I was just going to add there, we know we've seen some really difficult situations for children choking on food. So that's of particular importance, what's in that lunchbox if it comes in from home, that yes, you might be on that journey and working with that parent, but just really thinking about foods that pose a choking hazard to children, we'd expect a little bit of intervention there more than that journey. That's going to need something a little bit more immediate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Caroline. So next question, is this guidance for childminders and wraparound childcare providers?
And I would say, to answer that one, then yes, it is, because Laura, the DfE's EYFS applies to all registered early years providers. So yes, childminders and settings providing wraparound care before and after the school day or during school holidays, and also those people who are registered with the childminder agency.
Thank you. Will Ofsted expect settings to follow the menu planners in the guidance?
Caroline, I'll let you do
interesting. So the planners are examples, and the menus are included as, it's a helpful guide as to the potential options to steer you, give you ideas. What's important is that the menus for children should be planned carefully. Menus should consider the nutritional value and include a variety of foods. We want to be able to see that when creating menus, you also include things in respect of special dietary requirements and needs children might have over and above. So it's considering all of that, but using your knowledge. I'm sure providers are well versed already at providing variety of different meals, but actually it's quite nice to have some different options and some different menu ideas and some different suggestions there.
Thank you. Will Ofsted expect settings to have evidence and documentation ready to show?
I think we're really clear, aren't we, around the documents that we would want to see on inspection, and we wouldn't want to see anything that's over and above what's in the EYFS, and that's very clear in our early years, published early years inspection handbook. So considering food and drink providers must record and act on information from parents and carers about a child's dietary needs. And, you know, there may be a time when, bearing in mind that we don't explore every single requirement on inspection, but there may be a time when an inspector might want to explore with you some of the decisions you're making about your meal times, and that may involve looking at documents, or it may be through discussion, but we won't be expecting to see anything over and above what you're required to keep in terms of the EYFS. The EYFS sets that kind of like benchmark, doesn't it?
Thank you. So will Ofsted expect all staff to know the nutrition guidance or be experts on nutrition?
Oh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? So, you know, setting leaders should support staff to understand the food and nutrition policies that you have, as you would do with your other policies and procedures. There isn't an expectation that practitioners suddenly become dietitians overnight. The guidance gives you the links to the knowledge that you're going to need. So there's lots of helpful links in that guidance document to other websites with a raft of information, which should be enough to enable you to deliver the requirements of the EYFS without the need to become a dietitian.
That's great, thank you. I think we've got some time for questions. I'm sure Seb will tell me if we don't, but we have had some questions coming in whilst we've been talking. So this one is for DfE. It says, can we have some more clarity on desserts that would be suitable apart from fruit and yogurt? For example, would apple crumble be a suitable dessert? Okay, so we can't outline each dessert that's going to be appropriate, as preparation and nutritional content can vary, because I think there's probably a plethora of ways that you can make an apple crumble. But what you should do is look at the foods in the table that you need to avoid or that you should provide. So, for example, you should avoid foods that are high in saturated fat, sugar and salt. So the guidance does list things like unsweetened rice pudding as another example of a potential side dish or second dish dessert option. We've got one that's, oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I'm happy to take, there's another one. Please, could you give us an idea of how you will inspect special EY provision settings where there may be a large percentage of children with a highly restricted diet due to their SEND and sensory differences, and where other professionals are already working with children and are fully aware of their potential nutrition deficits? Wendy, did you want to take that? Read it out?
I was just going to say that's completely one of those ones where thinking about the context, thinking about the individual needs of those children and the rationale for why you make the choices that you make for those individual children. I mean, yeah, that's an ideal one where those conversations would be around those needs of those individual children and being aware of, you know, what they need, and because they may well be having those highly restricted diets.
Definitely. I can see another one for Ofsted, as this is new guidance, also that it applies to school nurseries and reception EYFS classes. Can you confirm that school inspectors will be aware of and expect the provision to be following the guidance? Yes, in a nutshell, anybody who's inspecting provision that's covered by the EYFS would be aware of all the supplementary documents and requirements within that. So yes, they would be. Anything you want to add to that, Wendy?
Yeah, I think again though that, you know, it would, whether it would routinely come up through on every inspection, it would depend.
Doubt it would, and it wouldn't come up on every early years regulatory visit either. It's not something for visiting outside of inspection unless that was a particular focus, unless a concern had been raised about that, then we would come in and talk to you about that. Otherwise, as Wendy says, we don't look at every single requirement when we visit.
Okay, thank you very much. I think they're all the questions for me. I don't think there are any more for Ofsted.
No, just a quick read.
Brilliant. Okay, then we can wrap that up. Thank you so much, Wendy and Caroline. That was really useful.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to both the Ofsted and DfE teams there for sharing their insights into the upcoming changes to the EYFS nutrition guidance and obviously how that will affect our practice from September. And thank you to all of those who sent in questions. That was really fantastic to see the high level of engagement there. And if your question wasn't answered, unfortunately, we will endeavour to try and get that answered post-event. And now we can move on to our first guest speaker, Claire Theobald from the British Nutrition Foundation. Thank you, Claire.
Great, thanks, Seb. So my name's Claire, and I'm an Education Services Manager at the British Nutrition Foundation. So I come from a background in primary teaching, and a large part of my role at the British Nutrition Foundation is developing materials to support early years educators and primary teachers teaching young people about healthy eating, cooking, and where food comes from. So today what I wanted to do really was just to say very briefly a little bit of something about the British Nutrition Foundation, and then talk through kind of some examples of the materials that we have on our programme, which is called Food: A Fact of Life, so that you're more aware of, say, what's available, and that you can go and take a look when you get a chance. So the foundation then, so we've been around, we're a public facing charity, and we've been around for, I think it's approaching 60 years now, and our main role really is to take sort of scientific evidence-based nutrition science and translate that into something that's sort of more digestible for the public. So we've got around 18 people in our organisation, and it's a combination of former teachers and nutritionists and dietitians, and it's the nutritionists and the dietitians who tend to look, at the scientific research around nutrition, and then pass out those messages, and that allows us in the education team to look at how we communicate those to schools and early years settings, etc. So just to let you know, really, that on the website itself, we have on the nutrition.org.uk website, we have information for different audiences, and it's not just young people, it's also right up into adults and older people as well. But just specifically today, obviously our focus is on early years, and we've got information for right from baby, toddler, preschool, right up to children and teens, etc. And that information just helps people understand more about the dietary requirements at specific ages, what foods can meet those needs, how much of them is required, etc. So portion size guidance. And we've actually got some lovely, obviously you've got your DfE information on portion size, but we've got a really nice, very practical guide on the website that's free to download, that sort of goes into how many spoons of different foods and things can make up what might be an appropriate portion for a young person. So good to have a quick look on there when you get a chance for a bit of background information to support you feeding your young people. And then I just go a little bit more now into Food: A Fact of Life. So we've actually got a separate website because we've got so many materials for early years and for primary and secondary that we have actually a dedicated website called Food: A Fact of Life. And this has been around for quite a few years as well. I think it's over 30 years now. And this program's been around. It's completely free, and the website's ungated, so anyone can go on, have a look, use the materials that are there. And the purpose really is to provide sort of high quality materials to teach about healthy eating, cooking, and where food comes from. And they are linked to different curricula around the UK. So obviously in England, that's the national curriculum in schools and the early years foundation stage framework. So wherever people are in the UK, they can come to the website and find materials that are going to help them, teach their children what they need to know. So these are the kind of resources that are available on the site. So when you go on and you go into the early years area, you can find activity ideas. So there'll be notes to help you run various sessions and background information to give you, more information to talk to the children about. We've got lots of visual resources, which you'll see in a moment. So we have lots of food cards, which are obviously lovely for displays and discussions with young people. There's lots and lots of recipes on the site, and I say, coming from a teaching background myself, where there was no kitchens in primary schools really for doing food lessons, you have to be quite creative and look at making sort of non-cooked dishes, so salads and fruit salads and all sorts of different things. So we've got loads of recipes that are sort of non-heat recipes on the site, which are really ideal in early years settings. And I know early years practitioners are very good at doing practical food work, and unfortunately less so as it goes up into primary, but we've got lots of support there to help. And lots of guidance and things as well, so information about the Eat Well guide and things like that can use too. So these are the main areas on Food Effective Life. So this is the website. I don't know if some people have seen it already. I really hope so, or we need to do a bit more promotion. But this is what the website looks like, and it's very simply arranged. So, but by age group along the top of the website, and in our 3 to 5 years. So our materials start from age 3 up to year 5 for sort of early and younger children, and we've got these the sort of the links there in green. Those are the areas that you find once you go into the 3 to 5 tab. So I just wanted to talk you through a few types of things that you might find. So we've got, say, the different areas in the 3 to 5 tab. So we've got healthy eating, cooking, where food comes from. And I'm going to talk you through a few of those resources, and then just talk you through an example of one of our activity packs as well. So as I was saying before, we've got lots of different sorts of food imagery, good for displays or conversations, or getting children to do different sorting activities and things like that. And it's interesting, a few years ago we worked with the University of Reading, because they'd done a really interesting piece of research that sort of discovered if children were sort of reading simple picture books and looking at pictures of vegetables, and how they're prepared and things like that, that made them more likely to then like fruit and vegetables that they'd previously said they disliked, or be more willing to try them. And the sort of psychology behind it was that it made them more familiar and less anxious about a natural anxiety to new things if they'd seen pictures, for example, of broccoli being cut and where it had come from, etc. So there's good evidence that showing children lots of images, talking about food and things, can break down that natural anxiety that might stop them wanting to try it. And then we've got activities like the cut and stick foods here that you can see. So again, getting some of those sort of fine motor skills going on with children using scissors and things. And we've got a food book too. So this is it's in the form of a PowerPoint, and it can be printed out and sort of stapled and made into a nice food book. So young children can monitor their tasting experiences. So you can do food tasting in your setting, and they can document which foods they like, and they could stick the foods in from the stick sheet or draw their own, and then they can sort of indicate with a face what they think of the foods and foods they might be willing to try again. And there's also other sort of simple pages in this book that gets them to think about foods they like and foods members of their families likes as well, so they can sort of take it home, have a conversation with parents and carers too. And this is another area under the healthy eating part of the website, and I think we're making these slides available afterwards. So green links can take you straight through to these when you get hold of the slides later. But we're quite keen, for early years to start understanding, healthy eating. And we've got our UK healthy eating model, the Eat Well Guide. But obviously the real guide, as we might see it on posters around, is much more detailed and too complicated really for younger children. So we've created a really simplified version of the poster. So this is something, you can put up in your setting and talk to children about, and they can start to become familiar, with foods as belonging to different groups. So we've got a game as well based on this, and this is about getting them, familiar with what belongs together, what is a food group, with a view to, as they get older, understanding that they need to eat a balance and variety of foods from different groups. So there's a nice game here where we cut out the food cards. It's a game for sort of four young people at a time. They turn the food cards upside down the table, and then they've got one of these Eat Well Guide game boards each, and they take it in turns to take a food and see if they can put it onto their game board and try and fill the four squares that are the four main food groups. And I think this is really helpful, I say, when you're, children eating meals in the setting, that they, you can use these images to sort of talk about what they're eating at the time. Can they find that on the Eat Well Guide? Almost like a bingo. What's in your meal today that's on the Eat Well Guide? And just sort of have general conversations and which of these foods have they tried, and things like that. So just opening up conversation about about what healthy eating is. And then we've got, these are a few examples from our cooking area. So we've got resources that look at hygiene and, cooking equipment. So we've got a get ready to cook sort of slide set PowerPoint. And this is something nice that you could look at on a tablet or a screen in your setting and almost tell it like a story, really. It's got two characters in it called Ronnie and Alicia, and they go through the getting ready to cook steps. So they talk about what they need to do. They need to wash their hands, tie back their hair, put on aprons, roll up their sleeves, and then they know that they're ready to cook. So this is a nice way of starting to introduce to children, food hygiene and safety, and knowing that they need to, prepare themselves. So when they've made some food, it's safe to eat. So that introduces the idea, and then there's different cards that show each of the stages, again, that could be displayed in your setting to remind everybody what they need to do to make sure the food they make is safe to eat. So that's one of the units, and then there's also a unit on. Sorry, Steph, can we go back one? There's also on equipment as well. So we've got, again, loads of cards and almost a jigsaw game of putting together equipment. And this is really to get children to be able to recognise different cooking equipment, to be able to name it, so that they're expanding their vocabulary and, learning what things are called so they can refer to them and so on. And then where food comes from. So two units in the where food comes from area are seasons and sorting. So we've got some nice images of foods that are ready in different seasons, and some guidance on how to chat to children about, the foods they can see perhaps growing at different times of the year and when they're ready to eat. And then we've got some nice food cards as well, which show a food as we might see it in a shop or when we're going to eat it, and then also how it grows. So, for example, we've got the tomatoes and the potatoes there. So we can talk about, tomatoes growing on the vine, they're growing above the ground, how they ripen, how they change colour and become ready to eat. And then looking at, potatoes here as well. Excuse me, and they go obviously growing under the ground, and there's lots of different foods on these cards as well, so they're great. You can separate them, maybe hand them out and see if the children can pair themselves up with their food and how it grows, or get them to sort themselves into different things like fruits or vegetables or dairy foods, etc. So there's lots of activity ideas and suggestions for using these cards. And so just to look at, say, one example of the activity pack. So this is our most recent resource added to the early years area. So we developed 6 activity packs with sort of different food themes, and there's they match up with our general themes on the website, which is health eating, cooking, and where food comes from. But they also connect those to some of the early years areas of learning and development. So, for example, we've got the amazing allotments. So I'll talk you through a few of the resources in there. Next slide, please. So in the amazing allotments activity pack, this is kind of what you can expect to see, and the structure and what's available is the same across all these packs. So there'll be some notes to help you talk through key points. So in this activity pack here, the purpose really is it's about where food comes from. So obviously it's allotments and growing, and helping children understand the world. And also it's linked to counting, so it's all about counting from 1 up to 10. So there's a session notes, and then there's a slide deck, a PowerPoint, and these are example slides from that. So you'll see, first of all, there's an allotment. So this is to use as a sort of a stimulus, talking point for you and your children. So looking at what is this? Have you seen an allotment before? What's growing here? Have you grown any food before, etc. And then it goes through different things that might grow on the allotment. So we've got the pictures of the tomatoes there, and there's different things like asparagus and courgettes, different things for them to say name, and also to count. So they've been chosen deliberately. I think we've got a slide with 3 carrots on, a slide with 7 sticks of asparagus, etc. So it's about counting and recognising those foods. And then where you see the 6 carrots at the bottom there, that's a set of carrot cards. And so for all the vegetables that come up when you're talking about the allotment, there's a set of cards, and this is for an imaginative play activity after you've been chatting with the children, where they can you can cut out the cards and give them, and then they can plant or lay different cards out in an area in your setting to create their own imaginary allotment. And we suggest as well, you maybe provide a watering can and some dark cloth to create a shed and things like that. So creating a nice imaginary play area, and as they getting them counting and talking about the vegetables. And then there's an activity here, the allotment board game. So we've also got 2 sort of nets for dice, one with numbers on like you'd expect, and another one that's a dice made of carrots, peas, asparagus, courgettes and tomatoes, as you see in the allotment. And the children roll both dice, and then they'll get a number and a food, and then they get to colour that in on their board. So they're trying to build their allotment by rolling their dice. And then the last activity at the end there is an at-home activity. So all of these activity packs come with something for the children to take home and do at home. So to say continue the conversation with their parents and carers. And this one's about, say, counting and colouring in the different vegetables on this sheet, and then having a go at writing those numbers. So I say that's all I'm going to talk to you about today, but I hope that's been a useful indication of the kind of resources that we've got available. As I say, they're all free, and you can just go and print off, take whatever you like from the website. We have a newsletter that comes out once a month that updates on our latest materials and things, so you might want to sign up for that. We have a Twitter account, and we get quite a lot at different times of year, sort of like when we have our health eating week and things like that. We'll get quite a flurry of responses on Twitter, and quite a lot from early years, which is absolutely lovely. And then my email address is there at the bottom in case anybody has any questions or wants to get in touch after today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire, and thank you for sharing the wealth of free resources available on your foundation's website. Really appreciate that. And so now we can move on to our final guest speaker presentation, as I welcome Catherine Lipp. Over to you, Catherine.
Super, thank you, Feb. Yes, welcome everybody. My name is Catherine Lipp. I am a registered nutritionist, specialising in early years nutrition, and I am also the early years nutritionist for Nursery Kitchen. And this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your role as early years educators at mealtimes, because I always say to early years educators that good nutrition goes much further than just the food that we put on children's plates. There is so much that you can do as an early years educator that will support a child's feeding behaviour, and it will start to kind of shape their early experiences with food. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And we're going to start at the very beginning, thinking about setting some of those foundations for positive meal times, and getting that mealtime environment right in your settings can really make the difference between a nice, calm, productive, supportive and nurturing mealtime occasion for those children, or a slightly chaotic and stressful mealtime environment. So there's lots that we can be thinking about even before the child comes to the table. Things like avoiding distractions, removing anything that might distract the child from the food on the table. Meal times are a really important time for children to benefit from exposure to new foods, potentially foods that they haven't come across elsewhere, that they're not particularly familiar with outside of the childcare setting. So if we can tidy away toys, tidy away activities from a previous session, and allow children really to focus on that mealtime, on the food that is available to them, that can be a really helpful way to ensure that they are benefiting fully from that exposure. If you have children who are very sensitive to things like noises and very sort of sensitive to smell as well, some foods when we're cooking them and when we place them on the table can be quite strong. And for some children who are very hypersensitive to those sensory aspects of foods or the environment, it can be useful to think about how you reduce the impact of those things as well. So making sure that there's not lots of noise going on at meal times, making sure that any very smelly foods are perhaps served in containers on the table which have lids on, or placing them down the other end of the table from a child who is very hypersensitive to those sorts of things. It's also really nice to make your mealtime a bit of an occasion. So getting children involved in setting up the table, how you present the food, things like laying tablecloths or having some paper flowers on the table, allowing the children to be helpers for the day, set out the knives and the forks and the cups and the cutlery. These are all things that you're probably very familiar with as well, but there's a lot of research that shows that getting children involved in the preparation of mealtimes can mean that they are more likely to take part and enjoy the food and potentially try new foods as well. We also want to think a little bit about children's sensory and their regulatory systems at mealtime. So if you have children who are quite reluctant to come to the table, particularly children who might be demonstrating food refusal behaviours, then doing some sort of activity before they come to the table, giving them plenty of warning and having a really structured routine around that can be really helpful. So it could be as simple as doing a little dance, doing 5-star jumps before they go and wash their hands in preparation for the mealtime. Those kind of things can really help to regulate their nervous system, regulate their sensory system, and make them perhaps a little bit more prepared for a mealtime or a food activity if they are feeling anxious or nervous. The seating position is also really important, and sometimes this gets overlooked. And it can make a real difference to how a child feels at a mealtime. So making sure that the seats that you have for children to sit in, no matter what age they are, so whether you're talking about infants all the way through to preschool, it can make a real difference to how they feel and how comfortable they are. So what we're looking for really is that children have something firm to rest their feet on, so either a footrest on a high chair, or they're able to place their feet firmly on the ground, and having good postural stability with a 90-degree angle at their hips, at their ankles and at their knees as well. That's a really good supportive position. It will help to reduce things like postural fatigue, so they're less likely to get fatigued and tired during the mealtime. It can help to improve their concentration and their focus on the food. So even things as simple as looking at their seating position can make a big difference. Also making sure that children have the right tools to use at mealtime. So is the cutlery, the utensils that they're using, is it comfortable for them to hold? Are they capable? Have they got the skills, the motor skills to be able to use those? And if not, thinking about how you can adapt that so it's comfortable again. And so that will improve the child's confidence and competency at meal times. Now, depending on the size of your setting, you also want to think a little bit about how long your meal times are. You all know, as well as I do, that children of this age don't have very long attention spans, and sometimes keeping them at the table in the hope that they will just eat a few more mouthfuls can actually have the opposite effect. So, generally for children or in the early years, somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes for the duration of the meal time to include your main course and a second course is about the right length of time. If you find that meal times are becoming much longer than that, it can just mean that the child is becoming a bit restless, a bit fidgety, a bit fatigued, and potentially not having such a positive experience at mealtime. So consider the length of your meal times as well, and trying to reduce meal times so that children have ample time to eat, but they're not becoming distracted at meal times. And something I focus on a lot in terms of feeding children of this age is an approach called responsive feeding, which might be something you are familiar with or you've heard of before. Essentially, responsive feeding is an approach that allows children to self-regulate their own appetite. It allows them to check in with their internal cues, build their own intrinsic curiosity and motivation to eat, and feel confident and competent in eating. And if you think about it, all babies are born with the ability to self-regulate their own appetite. So when babies are born, they cry when they're hungry and they stop when they're full and they're satisfied. And that's how we know. We put trust in babies to regulate their own appetite. And children have the capability to do that throughout childhood. But what tends to happen is that as they get older and we transition onto solid foods and the caregiver is more in charge of that mealtime environment or more in charge of that feeding process, we tend to lose some of that responsive feeding approach. And we perhaps revert to more controlling feeding behaviours where we're trying to encourage or coax or persuade. Just 2 more mouthfuls, have a little bit more and then you can leave the table, have 3 more mouthfuls and then you can have your pudding. And actually all of those strategies, whilst they come from a really good place, because we want the child to try new things or to eat a little bit more, they override the child's natural cues, that natural curiosity, those internal cues of self-regulation, because we are trying to control how much they should be eating. And it can be really useful, particularly in the context of children who are perhaps a bit reluctant. We might call them fussy eaters or picky eaters or experiencing food refusal. It can be really helpful to come back to this responsive feeding approach. And essentially, this approach allows you as the caregiver to create that environment. And we've talked about the ways that we can do that. To communicate with the child, listen to their cues and their signals, whether that's through body language or words or sounds or expressions. You respond to their cues, you notice them, and you communicate back in a way that is appropriate for that child. So we want to respond to those child's communication skills in a way that is appropriate from a time point of view, that is emotionally supportive, and supportive for their developmental stage. And what happens then is that the child experiences the response that they were anticipating. They feel comfortable, they feel like you are listening to them, and that association, that experience becomes a positive one. When we do non-responsive feeding practices, which is where we are trying to coax or persuade or encourage or pressure the child to eat more than they are actually communicating with us that they want, that's when we overstep that mark and it becomes a non-responsive feeding practice and more of a controlling feeding practice. And those types of practices are the ones that can interrupt that self-regulation and can actually lead to more food refusal rather than food acceptance. So although we might think it's having a positive effect, it can actually have the opposite and can backfire slightly. And something that feeds into this really well is autonomy, and essentially that means choice. And this is something that's really helpful to remember, particularly in the context of those reluctant eaters or children who are experiencing food refusal. So your role as the caregiver is really at meal times to take care of what food is offered. So you and the nursery or the early years setting are in charge of what food is offered. You are also in charge of that routine. So you're in charge of the when as well, and also the where. So we're sitting down at the table together, we've got our comfortable seating position. That's your role when it comes to feeding children, the what, the when, and the where. The child should be in charge of how much, if any, they want to eat. And so we're giving them the autonomy, we're giving them the choice, the control over how much, remembering that they have this innate ability to be able to self-regulate their own appetite, to know how much they need for a particular time or day. We want to encourage that self-regulation. We don't want to hamper that in any way. And by giving that autonomy and that control and that choice over portion sizes of the food that's on offer, we can really support that positive relationship with food. We can really support that responsive feeding approach. And that has really important far-reaching implications for their health outcomes and the facilitation of nice, relaxed, enjoyable meal times for that child. So I really like the phrase, you provide, the child decides. So you're in charge of the what, the where, and the when, and the child is in charge of how much, if any, of that food they want to eat. And I think what's really important to mention with this as well is some of the things that can influence a child's appetite. Now, there's nothing more erratic than a young child's appetite. It can change from meal to meal, from day to day, from week to week, really depending on what they're going through at that particular time. And as you'll see here from this slide, there are so many different things that can impact a child's appetite that we don't necessarily understand or appreciate or can't experience for them. And that's why allowing the child to self-regulate their own appetite is really important. If a child is feeling under the weather, or they're tired, or they're going through a bit of a developmental stage, they've maybe there's been a change to their routine, they've moved rooms in their early years setting, all of these things can impact a child's appetite. And what's really important is that we don't try to override their self-regulation, but we allow them the choice, the control to decide how much they want to eat. We continue to offer food regularly, and you will be doing that in your settings with potentially 3 meals a day and several snacks in between. And as long as you are taking care of the what, the where, and the when, you are making sure you've got that environment where the right foods are on offer at regular intervals through the day, and we can allow the child to decide how much, if any, of that they want to eat. And these are some of the kind of signs of fullness that you might notice from children. So related to that appetite, I won't read through them all, but there are some really important ways that children will communicate with us that they have had enough. And again, it's really important to try to respond to those cues appropriately, remembering that the child has the capability to self-regulate their appetite. If they haven't eaten much for a day or several days, and that's unusual for them, there's usually a reason behind that, and they will often self-regulate, and a few days later they will make up for that lost time. They're not necessarily programmed to eat the same amount at each meal time each day. It's very normal to have that fluctuation in appetite, and a lot of that is led by growth spurts as well. So you will notice if a child is going through a growth spurt, just like when they're babies, they are demanding more food and their appetite is higher. And when they're not, or when there's something that's troubling them, their appetite will drop. And it's important that we respect those internal cues and what their body is telling them, so that they can learn to trust their bodies, to respond to their internal cues, and know that they we will also listen to those. So if a child is either telling you verbally, or they're clenching their mouth shut, turning their head away, they might start throwing food or pushing food away, becoming very restless or fidgety or distracted. These are all signs and communications that potentially the child doesn't want the food at that particular time. It may not be that they don't like the food, it's just that there's something that is affecting their appetite and they're not wanting to take part in the mealtime at that particular time. So we almost want to try and put ourselves in the child's shoes and think about how would it make us feel if somebody was pushing us to eat, even though we had told them repeatedly that we didn't want it, or we were too full, or we weren't hungry at that particular time. So again, this supports that autonomy and that responsive feeding approach that we've been talking about. Another thing that really helps to build a child's intrinsic motivation to eat. So again, we're talking specifically here about children who might struggle with new foods, or they might be reluctant eaters. They're experiencing some food refusal. We want to focus on that responsive feeding approach. We want to give them the choice and the autonomy over how much they're eating. And one of the other things that's really important is the competency when it comes to feeding. Just like any other skill that a child is learning to do, feeding is actually really complex. And I think often it's very easy for us as caregivers to think of it as a two-step process. We sit down and we eat, and we really overlook a lot of those sensory steps that children have to go through before they can get to that very end goal of eating. For some children, it will just be they're able to tolerate food on the plate or on the table, but they don't want to go anywhere near it. For other children, it will be that they're happy to touch it with a fingertip, or potentially with a couple of fingers, or hold it in their hand, but they can't go any further with it. And that's all really, really normal when we are talking about food refusal with certain children. So building a child's competency is really about making them feel like a competent eater, building their confidence, and supporting them with that learning journey, just like we would do with any other area of learning, any other task that a child was finding challenging. We would find ways to support them, to create that right environment, to give them the right tools so that they feel like, I can do this if I want to. And sometimes when it comes to food, there might be a little bit of criticism, or we label them as a fussy eater, or we tell them, not to spit their food out, to remember their table manners, hold their knife and fork properly. And if there's constant criticism or correction at mealtimes, that can affect a child's competency around food. So we want to make sure that the types of foods that are offered, and also the methods of feeding, are appropriate for that child's developmental stage. Do they need support feeding themselves? Do they prefer to feed themselves with their hands and not use cutlery? Are they finding cutlery really challenging, but they love to self-feed with their hands? Finding out what is right for that child in the context of their scenario is really important to make sure that we are providing both the tools and the food that are appropriate for that child's capabilities, so that they go away feeling more confident and less frustrated when it comes to food. Another thing that can be really helpful, again, in the context of feeding reluctant eaters or food refusal, is family style serving. Now, essentially, this means in your settings, if you're able to encourage self-service, plating up small bowls of the food and placing it in the centre of the table. So we try to avoid pre-plating the food for the child already, because what we've done there is we've taken away some of that choice, some of that autonomy and control for the child, which often they're craving at this age. By serving food in the centre of the table, children will be able to benefit from self-serving, so building those motor skills that are really helpful for supporting their development, but also allowing more of that choice and that control and that autonomy at meal times. So they would start with an empty plate. The food is served in central serving bowls in the middle of the table, and we allow children to serve themselves. Now, you will have to think about how practical this is for you to do in your settings and be very aware of each child's dietary requirements, making sure that any children with very severe allergies are supervised and that they don't have access to food that isn't appropriate for them to be eating. But where possible, this can be a really supportive way to allow children to have that control, have that choice, to feel like a competent eater, and really feeds into that whole responsive feeding approach. It's also really helpful when you are thinking about your mealtime environment to make sure that children are sat in small groups so that they have at least one other person there eating with them. That could be a peer or it could be a staff member. And that can be really helpful from a role modeling perspective as well for children to learn from. And that brings me nicely on to talk about role modeling. So we know that children love to copy, and it's really important for them to see good role models when it comes to eating a variety of food. So whether it's parents, siblings, family members, their peers at nursery, yourself as early as educators, you can all be really good role models for children. And when it comes to food, it means that the children are more likely to imitate the behaviour of those that they spend time with. So we don't necessarily have to say anything or ask them to copy us. It's just about being there and demonstrating, showing them what they can do. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. The important thing is to try and forget your own likes or dislikes or preconceptions when it comes to food. It can be really difficult to do that as an early years educator, particularly if you do have very strong preferences when it comes to foods. But it's really important to try to avoid making negative comments, even consider your body language too. So a very subtle screwing up of the nose or that's a smelly dish we've got today. All of those things children will pick up on. So it's really important to think about not just your verbal language, but also your body language as well. For children, again, who are very hyper aware of food, they might be very nervous or anxious around food and they're experiencing lots of food refusal. It's important to note that the discussions that you have at mealtime don't always have to be focused around food. Actually, what we want to do is we want to focus on each child as an individual, and think about how are they finding this mealtime? How challenging or how easy, supportive, nurturing is this for them? If you have children who are very anxious and struggling with particular foods that are on the table, sometimes it can be helpful just to keep them regulated and to keep them calm and relaxed, to actually not focus on the food itself, to focus on them, talk about other things that are going on in their day, things that you've been doing, activities you've been doing this morning, or what you're going to be doing this afternoon, for example. We want those meal times to feel like a nice, sociable, but relaxed and supportive and nurturing environment for each child, so that they go away, even if they haven't eaten anything at that particular meal time, or even if they haven't tried a new food at that particular meal time, we still want them to go away remembering that experience positively. So the key thing is to focus on connection, building that relationship with the child over food. And sometimes that can mean talking about the food if the child is comfortable with that. In other contexts, it might be helpful to focus your language away from the food and away from the mealtime, just so that they're able to stay calm and stay regulated at each mealtime. So you can base those conversations depending on the context of the child. And here's some examples, and they are just examples. This isn't designed to be a particular script as such, but it can just demonstrate how really subtle changes in our language can support or influence a child's feeding behaviours. So what we want to do when we're talking about food with children, particularly again in the context of those reluctant eaters, is to try and keep our language as neutral as possible when we're talking about food. So we might sort of try to avoid any opinions such as, oh, this is really yummy or that's really delicious, and instead try and stay very factual about the food, focusing on the colour, the texture, the temperature, the shape, and some of the things that Claire has spoken about, some of those activities can be a really great way to increase a child's exposure around food outside of the mealtime context, where actually that pressure doesn't necessarily exist. So some of those activities from the British Nutrition Foundation can be a really helpful resource to support children outside of that mealtime environment, and you might find you get more curiosity and more exploration with foods in those contexts than you do at a mealtime. But whatever situation you're in, we want to try and be a little bit careful with our language and how we're talking about food. So as I say, rather than bringing in your own personal opinion of food, we can be very factual about it. So instead of saying, do you like it? We might be very factual and just talk about how the pasta is warm and it smells like tomatoes. What we're doing there is we are building a bit of a sensory picture for children in the context. So we are demonstrating what that food might feel like when they put it in their mouth, and we are demonstrating some of that flavour as well, and the smell of that food. So if the child then is ready to start trying the food, they have some anticipation of what it might feel like and what it's going to smell like when they bring it closer to their mouth. Instead of lots of questions, why don't you try the cucumber today? That can feel quite pressureful for a child who is feeling really nervous about trying cucumber. So actually, we want to remember that we want to give them that choice, that control, that autonomy. So rather than asking them to try something, just us sitting there and eating it with them, or their peers eating it with them, can be enough. We don't necessarily have to try through lots of verbal prompts, particularly if that child is feeling nervous about cucumber. So instead, you might give the child the option that actually, it's okay, you can leave that cucumber on the plate if you don't want to try it today. And what you're doing there is you're automatically reassuring them. You're making them aware that there's no expectation that they have to eat the cucumber. And you're also acknowledging that they might not want to try it today, but they might be happy to try it another day. So sometimes when you say to a child, it's okay, you don't have to eat it, you can almost see the physical relief on their face and in their body language, because that pressure suddenly has gone away. And that means that, yes, they might not try the cucumber that day, but they are going to have a much more positive experience with that cucumber. And next time they face it, they will remember it more positively and might be more empowered and confident to explore it a little bit further. Instead of saying things like there's no pudding or second course until you've tried the broccoli, or you can't leave the table, all of those things are a bit more of that controlling feeding practice rather than the responsive feeding that we've talked about. We're taking some of that autonomy away from the child. So actually, instead of using bribes and negotiations like that, we can be very factual about, oh, this piece of broccoli looks like a tree, or, I wonder how many peas a crocodile could fit into its mouth. Making communication, making language fun and enjoyable and imaginative around children can be really helpful without putting lots of pressure on them. Sometimes praise can feel like pressure as well. So the example there, well done, you've eaten so well. But for lots of children, that's really appropriate and it's absolutely fine to praise. But again, for children who are very nervous or wary about food and they're really struggling to accept new foods, even praise can sometimes feel like quite a lot of pressure, because they might feel that there's almost an expectation next time that, okay, I've eaten it once, I'm going to have to do it again. So it's really nice to acknowledge that a child has tried a food or has eaten something that they haven't eaten before, rather than putting lots of praise on and giving them lots of high fives and things like that. You can again be very factual. So, oh, I heard some really loud crunching there. That was a great sound. And you're focusing there on a sensory aspect of the food, but you're not layering the praise on, which could be interpreted as pressure. And again, that final example, Yum, I really like the carrot. I think you'll like it too. Just because we have likes and dislikes doesn't mean that the children are going to have the same ones. So again, that can feel a bit like pressure. And so again, another example of how you could switch that up would be to talk about how that carrot feels, what sounds you're noticing, what it feels like in your mouth, or what it tastes like. So saying something like the carrot is cool and crunchy, have a listen when I bite into it, or have a listen when I crunch it. What you're doing there is you're allowing the child playfully to explore some of the sensory aspects of that food. And again, that's giving them some anticipation of, okay, if I'm ready to try the carrot, I know it's going to feel cool, and I know that there might be a loud crunching sound when I take a bite of that. So you're allowing them to sort of prepare when they are ready to explore that food themselves. So that's just a few examples of how you can think about your language and maybe make some tweaks, again, in the context in particular of those children who are experiencing food refusal or find it really difficult to explore new behaviours. And that's all from me. I could talk to you about food refusal all day, but we're going to allow some time for questions, I believe. So thank you very much. My contact details are on this final slide. So if anybody has questions or would like to reach out to get in touch, then please do feel free.
Wonderful. A huge thank you to both Claire and Catherine there for the two wonderful presentations. I was very engaged myself and learned lots myself as well. So it was lovely to hear from you both. Thank you. And as you say, Catherine, we've now moved on to a question and answer session for both Claire and Catherine. The Q&A section is open that you can access at the top of your screen. We've noticed that a few questions have come in and they all around the same subject, so I'll kind of merge the questions that have come in. That's probably the quickest way to get around the questions, and they all seem to be focused towards parents. So what are the sort of suggested ways? Are there any resources or ways to engage with parents to get the message across around effective nutrition, and just really drill home what the settings are trying to do in terms of nutrition to get the message across?
Sure. Claire, have you got anything you want to start with from a resources point of view?
Oh, well, only that, I say, with some of the packs, like the 6 activity sessions, we do try to include something to take home and do at home, whether it's like playing like a starchy food bingo in the supermarket, looking for the pasta and the rice and things like that. But in terms of nutrition, no. It's more about the activities around food, I would say, from Food A Fact of Life.
Sure. Yeah. And from my perspective, I think, having really open conversations and communication with parents is really key. So sort of understanding what questions they have or what sort of areas of concern or interest they have when it comes to nutrition is really, really helpful. I think if you have a really strong food and nutrition policy in your setting, that can be a really helpful way of you sort of dictating what your unwritten rules are, your approach to healthy eating. Make sure that that is shared with your parents and your families. Sharing recipes is a great idea. So often parents, and you might experience this in your settings, often parents will say, my child eats everything at nursery, but they won't eat those foods at home. And so sometimes, that's really normal. And sometimes that's not actually to do with the food itself. It's more to do with that environment and the things, all of these things that you might be doing in that mealtime setting that are a bit harder to replicate for parents at home. But I think, sharing recipes that the children enjoy at nursery can be really helpful, so parents can see what types of foods they're having, what types of ingredients you're including, and if you're obviously complying with the nutrition guidelines, that's going to get some of those messages across. I know there are some resources. So aside from Food A Fact of Life, the British Nutrition Foundation have some really great resources called 5532, which looks at the different food groups and portion sizes, which is another really big topic for children in this area. So some of those there's a really nice poster which talks about those different food groups and those portion sizes. So if you're looking for other resources, again, you know, I would have a look at the British Nutrition Foundation 5532. Those numbers correspond to the number of portions from each food group to be offering. So that can be helpful, but I wouldn't tend to focus too heavily on nutrition messages. I think sharing best practice, sharing what your policy is, your stance, sharing some recipes that you think the parents might find helpful, and activities like Claire said from Food Effective Life that the parents can replicate at home. A lot of it is about that exposure to food, that nice connection that parents can also build at home with their families. And that can speak volumes when it comes to improving children's nutrition or food acceptance at home.
Wonderful, thank you. And in the interest of time, I think we've probably just about got time for one more question. It's almost 6 p.m. A really interesting question has just come in relation to the responsive feeding that we've just covered. How would you suggest we handle encouraging children to drink when they're reluctant to do so? For example, on a hot day when it's very important that they do so for health reasons.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and actually I didn't talk about drinks in the slides too much, so it's a really good one to raise, so thank you for that. And I think, yes, particularly we want to be encouraging children and just making sure that they are prompted. Again, it's about reminding children, I think, when they have a really busy day at nursery and they're distracted doing lots of activities, particularly if it's a hot day, we need to be reminding them and prompting them. So we're not talking about necessarily pressuring them to drink more, but having access, really free available access to water throughout the nursery day is really important. So if it's fine weather and you're doing lots of outdoor play, perhaps move your water station to outdoors, keep it in the shade so that the water doesn't get too warm. You can have sort of interesting jugs or cups or straws to make it a bit more appealing for children if they are not drinking too much and you're worried about hydration, or even things like adding mint or cucumber to your water to make it a little bit more interesting and exciting. You can turn it into a little bit of an activity as well. So I think it's important to remember to move that water station around with you so that children are reminded where it is, they can access it easily, and think of engaging ways that you can make it appealing for them. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Claire.
Yeah, I just recently heard a nice story about I think it was like a reception class, so that they were quite young, and they'd created a water wall, and so the teacher or whatever had put like shoe tidies like low level on the wall so that the children could put their water bottles in them, and they had a picture of the children on the front of them as well, so they knew whose was whose, and they could just wander up to the water wall and have a chat with their friends and have a drink at the water wall. And I thought that sounded lovely and, you know, really, really appealing, and say all these shoe tidies and all they're the right height for them was a nice sort of motivator.
Love that. Yeah, great idea.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And thank you for the amazing questions. I do apologise to everyone that sent a question in and that hasn't been answered. I do apologise, but we are very close to 6 p.m. We will try our best to get back to all of the questions that have been sent. So thank you so much to everybody that did send in a question earlier for the opening section of the presentation, and also just now for Claire and Catherine. Very much appreciated. So as we wrap up, I hope you found the event to be interesting and helpful, with lots of takeaways to help enhance your nutrition awareness and practice, so that we can provide even healthier and more nutritious settings for the children within our care. A huge thank you to all of today's speakers. They've all been absolutely fantastic. It's been great to listen to each and every one of them. So thank you so much for giving up your time and sharing your expertise with us. You will now be able to see on screen a QR code. If you were to scan that QR code, that will take you through to the event feedback form. Really encourage you to access that and leave feedback for as many questions as you possibly can. It's really, really important for us to help guide our future future service. It gives us lots of insight as to what we need and want to be including into these events in future. So please do fill out that form when you find the chance to do so. We will send a follow-up email as well, so if you've not got the opportunity to do it right now, you will receive an email and you can complete the form that way. And for those who want to revisit any part of today's event, or if you couldn't catch anything, don't worry. The entire event has been recorded and it will be made available to view very shortly on the Foundation Years website, along with all of the presentation slides. And finally, I'd like to extend my gratitude to all of you in the audience for your attendance and engagement. I know it's quite difficult, isn't it, with personal and professional commitments. So we really do appreciate you giving up your time this evening. It's very much appreciated. And if you do have any other further questions, please do feel to reach out to Foundation Years directly. More than happy to speak with you. And also please do continue to engage with us via our website, our newsletters, and also our social media channels and handles, which you can see on screen now as well. So as we say our final goodbyes, thank you all again for your time. It's been wonderful to hear from all of our wonderful speakers with such a well-attended event. And let's continue to strive for nutritional excellence in all of our settings. Thank you.